JourneyIFC strives to create safe spaces to worship God. Know that you are welcome just as you are, regardless of religious background or lack thereof, skin color, political affiliation, sexuality, age, culture, or any other label you own or society throws on you. You are welcomed and celebrated here just as you are.
Our reading today comes from the first book of the Bible, which is named Genesis. This story comes from one of the creation narratives, and today we will focus on the character Eve. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. They heard the sound of God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God among the trees of the garden. But God called to the man and said to him, 'Where are you?' He said, 'I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself.' He said, 'Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?' The man said, 'The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate.' Then God said to the woman, 'What is this that you have done?' The woman said, 'The serpent tricked me, and I ate.'"
Thank you, Susan, for that story there. And great emphasis. There was exactly the emphasis I wanted to. That was perfect. So, like I said, we're starting this new series called She Persists. And this is where we're going to look at the different women in the Hebrew Bible. And this comes from the quote, "The nevertheless she persisted." And you may be familiar with this. Probably most of you are, if not all. But this was a feminist saying that was adopted in 2017 when the Synod voted to stop Senator Elizabeth Warren from speaking during the confirmation hearing of Jeff Sessions. And so Mitch McConnell, after the vote was taken, he was quoted as saying this: "She was warned, she was given an explanation, nevertheless she persisted." And so, inspired by this, we're going to look into the lives of women throughout the Hebrew scriptures that persisted despite the world being stacked against them in many different ways. So this first week, we're going to look at this mythical tale of the beginning of creation with Eve. But we're going to be inspired by people like Elizabeth Warren and all these so-called nasty women who can persist in really difficult circumstances. So today we open up our scene with this serpent who is crafty, we're told. And the Hebrew here is really interesting. Welcome, Gail. Glad to have you. And so the Hebrew is arum, which means sensible, shrewd, or crafty. I say this because in a moment I'll say another word that relates to this. But we just have to remember this word is interesting. The snake is crafty. And the snake talks, our first clue that this is not real life, this is a myth. And he talks directly to the woman, which we should know was just created a chapter before, like half a chapter before, not even a full chapter before. And she was, supposedly taken from the rib of Adam, making her this smaller piece of a man that somehow began to talk and breathe and became a full human. It's crazy. It's weird, And so Eve is this woman's name, and this name means life. But she actually is not given this name until after our story today, but for clarity, we're going to call her Eve. And she's confronted by this talking snake who asks her if God said she could not eat from any tree in the garden. So that's what the serpent starts with. Can you not eat from any tree? And the woman responds with her understanding of the truth. that no, she can eat from the trees in the garden, just not the one in the middle. She also says you can't even touch it or you'll die. Dun, dun, dun. Eve was not created when the rules were set in place, when Adam was told the rules of the garden, but she seems to have learned these rules somehow. It doesn't show in Scripture that she's even had a word or a conversation about it, but whenever the serpent asks, she knows that this is what you can and what you cannot do in this garden of Eden, which Eden here means delight. This garden of delight. These are the things you can and cannot do. However, when we compare Eve's understanding of the truth, of the rules, of all of that, to what God actually told Adam earlier, the chapter before, right before she was created, Eve has added a phrase in here that you can't touch the tree or you'll die. That wasn't originally in the warning. It was just don't eat of it. If you eat of it, you'll die. And so it's like, where did she get her information? Where is she adding this? Did Adam add this? Or did God talk to her? We don't know. There's been no conversation yet that we know of. And so this Eve, this character here, she knows the consequences of what happens with this tree, and she fears it so much that she thinks that even if she touches it, she will die. But at this point, she does not know the full truth, right? And so the crafty serpent says to her, come on, you won't die. No, instead, when you eat it, God knows that you'll become more like God, and you'll know good and evil. So Eve, in her very newly created body and her newly created mind, reasoned with this serpent and came to the conclusion that this tree is indeed good for food. So that's one good thing. It was pretty to look at. That's also great. And it could make her wiser. So at that point, it's a triple threat, right? These are all good things, at least in my opinion. So of course, she takes some fruit from this tree, because if it won't kill her like she's been told it will, why not indulge in this? So she takes a piece of fruit from the tree, and she takes and eats it. And then one of my favorite parts of this story follows this. She gives some of the fruit to her husband, or her man, as the Hebrew says, who's been there all along. He's just been sitting there. We think this is just Eve and the serpent. No, Adam is also there. He's been silently listening in on Eve and the serpent's conversation, and he hasn't added any sense of warning or suggested any other actions be taken. Adam, whose name means earth, is as quiet as the dirt. And so what does Adam do with his own will and accord? He eats the forbidden fruit as well, knowing exactly what he was doing, right? Then boom, their eyes are opened to a new way, and they now realize that they are naked. And so they have to go hide their bodies. And remember when I said that word earlier was important? Well, here the naked is erumim, which sounds a lot like Aram, which was, the crafty serpent, but now it means the nakedness. So it's this play on words of how the serpent is crafty, and how these people are vulnerable and naked, and how the snake is also naked. And it's this weird play on words that the Bible nerd in me had to tell you, because it really was interesting. And so the two of them, they run off in their innocence and their nakedness, and they make clothes out of fig leaves to cover their bodies. One funny thing about this verse here is there's actually a translation of the Bible called the Breeches Bible. And because at this point when they make the loincloths, someone translated it to, they fashioned themselves some breeches. And so there is a Bible that is the Breeches Bible. And again, that's just a Bible nerd thing that I had to share with you. Not important to the story. So when they finally go and they get their breeches on, they hear God walking in the garden, and they're wondering what's going on, and they hear this sound of God approaching. I'm like, what is that? Is that the leaves are rustling, the wind blowing in? Do they hear footsteps? Is God anthropomorphized, whatever the word is God a human in this as well? I don't know. But we know that it's evening and this breeze is blowing in. And when God looks for this man and this woman, they're nowhere to be found because they're hiding in the trees. So God calls out, guess to who? The man. And so he calls out to this man and he says, where are you at? And out of fear, Adam blurts out the truth that he hid because he was naked and he was scared. Adam is such a snitch right now. If Adam was my sibling growing up, I think I was the youngest, so I was more that sibling. And so Adam blurts out that he's naked, and God clearly knows something is wrong because they didn't know that they were naked before. So he says, how do you know you're naked? Did you eat from that tree I said not to eat from? And the man caves yet again and said, the woman did it. And then he completely throws the blame on her, right? She did it. She ate and then made me eat. I blame her. So God speaks to the woman here for the first time in the story. And actually, this is the first time God talks to a woman. This is the first time God speaks to Eve at all. Since she's created, this is the first conversation, and he speaks with her with disappointment in his voice. And he says, what is this that you have done? The woman, having not lied yet, just living into the truth that she knows, tells the truth that the serpent tricked her and she ate. But did the serpent really trick her? Is the serpent the one who's at fault here? But after this, the serpent is cursed, regardless of who's at fault. And then the woman isn't cursed necessarily, but she's burdened with childbearing pains. And the man is burdened with laboring in the fields for the rest of his days so that they can have food. And these become the kind of typical archetypes for men and women and snakes, I guess. So each character is given what sounds like a curse for this strange set of circumstances built upon lies and deception. But who deceived who, right? God told Abraham that there's this tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he said that that tree is off limits.
Who do you have?
Adam, yes, Adam, my bad. And God said eating of this tree would lead to death, right, Adam? But then Eve is met with a serpent who challenges this notion and helps Eve clarify the rules that she was handed down, assumingly from Adam, although we're not told how she gets this information. And it's interesting because this is actually the first conversation Eve ever has is with a snake. It's not with Adam, it's not with God. None of that's talked about. Maybe they have some side conversations that didn't make it into scripture. But the first person to acknowledge her humanity was the serpent. And they had this conversation. And the serpent says, you're not going to die if you eat of it. God just doesn't want you to be as wise as God. And you know what? The serpent doesn't lie. The serpent is telling the truth here. God is the one who tells the lie, saying if you eat of it, you will die. And we know that when they take of the fruit and they eat it, they become wiser and their health is spared. The serpent here is what Walter Brueggemann calls creation's first theologian, which I thought was really funny. They said that the serpent challenges this idea of God and finds this truth just like a theologian would. And so what is Eve doing? She's just consulting a theologian. That's all she's doing. And where is Adam in all of this? Adam, who's trying to save his own ass, isn't saying anything. And he's just going to God and blaming the woman. She did it. She made me eat of the fruit, while he stood by and watched. So why is Eve blamed for something that God seemed to lie about, that Adam supported with his silence and then his actions, and then the serpent helped her see straight through? Why does a blame fall on Eve? Well, because this is not exactly how creation began. This is, I hate to say it, is merely a myth. This isn't a real story. And if you think it's a real story, I guess that's okay, but I think for me, it's okay to let go of that and say, this is kind of a crappy story if we're going to look at it, right? Because for a long time, people have taken this and they've done some really harmful things with it. And I think this myth is, and I think myths often, beyond this one, are a better predictor of a society and a culture and what they believe, and less of a standard that we need to live by. So if we see it as this myth, we can realize that this is a mirror into a community, a way of life, a culture that is different from our own. It's not something that we have to necessarily adopt ourselves, but it gives us a look in. And so for a long time, the church has taken this and they said, this is how creation began. This is truth. And they've used it to blame women for the fall of humanity. And they've used it to explain away why women's birthing pains exist. And they say, well, you shouldn't have sinned, right, Eve? It's all because the woman sinned and it's all your fault, and blame, blame, blame. The church has used this story to justify that women are faulty pieces of men who mess up and lead men towards their own destruction.
Poor men, they're so weak.
I know, poor men, right? Poor Adam. I know I have so much. Oh, yeah. Not, yes, no.
I bet the serpent was male.
Right? Yeah, the serpent, and it does use male language for the serpent, right? We have to blame, we'll put some blame somewhere. But it seems that the church has taken this and they've tried to put all of the blame on women, and it shows that, okay, women are responsible for the damnation of men. But I'm going to be honest, this church right here, this faith community, Journey Imperfect, we're not doing it today. We're going to look at this in a different light. We're not going to stand by and let this happen anymore, especially as we begin this series on women in the Hebrew Bible. We're not going to start out blaming women for all the wrong in the world. Instead, we're going to read this story with a new light of liberation. This story is so often referred back to when people are talking about original sin. Even our song earlier talked about, original sin. And this is the idea that all of us were created good until Eve messed it up for us. And now we're all born broken, and that's it. Well, this would explain some of the terrible things that people do. Just look what's happening in Ukraine, and honestly what's happening in a lot of churches even. We know that people are messing up and doing harmful things over and over again. And if we can just explain it away with, we're all broken, we're all these original sinners, it's all Eve's fault, it kind of explains that away, but I don't think it's that easy. Because is this a design flaw written into our DNA as original sin dictates? Are we broken forever? Is it something we can't escape? Well, I hope not. And I hope y'all hope not either. Because this story never talks about sin. It doesn't talk about the fall of humanity. All of those things are things we've added to this story. They weren't there. We didn't read those. We haven't heard those. They're just things that we have put into this story. They do point us to a truth that we as humans don't always follow the rules. It's kind of our nature, and I think it's a lot of Journey's nature. That's probably why we're here, is because we don't like following the rules all that much.
We like to question.
Exactly, we like to question them, and that's good. But this story also teaches us more about human nature. It teaches that there's some part of us from the get-go that desires knowledge and wisdom just like Eve had when she talked with that serpent or that theologian and found God in a lie. But why is it deemed bad to question? Well, it's probably because this culture that wrote this mythological tale wanted us to believe that women seeking wisdom is a bad thing. And isn't that what men fear today? Isn't that what we hear in the Nevertheless She Persisted? A wise woman who persists even when she's told to stop, when it goes against the rules or the norms. It seems that the writer of this story feared that having women making decisions would lead to her being awoken to her divinely given nature, to want to learn and grow and mature and to know. But these things aren't bad, right? These are things we all do. It's part of our human nature, and they're not limited to women. We all do this. All of us in our varied genders have a desire to know and to be known, and this is not something to fear. In fact, this drive led Eve to a new food source that opened the gates for all wisdom, for all of us. We all get to take part of that because of what she did. And just imagine what would have happened if we didn't eat the fruit, right? Would all of creation still be trapped in that garden of delight like a prison, unaware of our own ignorance, blindly following a tyrannical God who is willing to punish us if we slip up and challenge authority? If we were still in Eden, would we be happily stuck, or would we be terrified of screwing up over and over? Bert Marshall, who's a theologian, says that the garden was a prison and not a paradise. And he's quoted saying that if we were stuck in Eden, there would be no differences, no innovation, no creativity, no diversity, no rebellion. I like that one. And no need for grace or redemption. And that doesn't sound like a place I want to live. The story reveals to us a culture that shamed women's desire for wisdom, A culture that saw our bodies as something to be hidden away, our sexuality as an extension of an error and not something to be embraced fully as a gift from God. A culture that was ready to blame the world for God's deception, and particularly blame a woman named Eve for all the messy humanity that we're stuck in. A culture that saw humanity as a broken place. This creation tale is what Samuel Terrian calls a true myth, which I thought was a really good way of framing that. He says a true myth is something that never actually happened, but happens every day. We live into our humanity, which makes us challenge God and seek wisdom, and we place blame on those who don't deserve it, and we mess up. But this story is one that we must engage because we all go through this, just this same idea. It's something that didn't happen, but happens every day. We're supposed to mess up. We're supposed to learn and grow. We're supposed to be like Eve and challenge authority. It's a part of our divinely given human nature. We're not meant to remain in that garden. We're meant to grow up and mature and make mistakes and embrace all of our created beingness. We're supposed to become more than what this garden kept us from becoming, in fact. Because if we stay in that garden, we may continue to think that women are broken men, or that they're the cause of our downfall, or that they're unfit to lead. And let me tell you, that is all crap. I'm telling this even on the Zoomers, recording this for history, that is crap. It's all lies that the patriarchy has dressed up in religion and tried to force us to believe over and over again. But it stops here today. Today we honor Eve for her desire for wisdom and her rebel heart. And we leave knowing that the world is full of good and evil, and we have knowledge of all of it. But that knowledge isn't bad, and in fact, that knowledge is what can lead us to fight for good in the world. Amen.
So much motivation comes from guilt. It seems to be the only thing that we learned in the Bible as kids. Don't let guilt be your motivation. When you point the finger at another person, remember there are 3 more pointing right back to the person who's probably responsible. So, here's what God has for you today. Don't exist in the shadow. Don't look into the shadow. If there's a shadow, there has to be a light to make one. Turn around, see the light, and walk in it. Go in peace. Amen.
Amen.